Good evening. We are in Matthew chapter 25. And as I usually do, I will put some of these, just a few of these up here, and the rest will go to the back. But we're almost through chapter 25. I'd kind of forgotten. I sometimes do that, you know. But chapter 25 crossword puzzle and a chapter 26 crossword puzzle. Wait a minute. Oh no. I thought I had them. It printed one of each. I thought I told it not to collate. Or maybe that's what I should have said was to collate. Anyway. 25 and 26 are up here. I just got to separate them. But we are toward the end of chapter 25. And I just realized I left my notes in here. Let me grab those. I'm going to need those. I can't ever. Sometimes I had the little option checked to collate these, and I thought it was. I thought I had it checked not to do that. But anyways, I'll separate those later. Because if I try to do that now, I won't be able to multitask. Y'all know I can't multitask. I'll be locked in on that, and I won't get anything else accomplished. But as I said, we're toward the end of chapter 25. We pretty much wrapped up with the parable of the talents last week. That goes down through verse, 30? Yes. And just a reminder, we were kind of running out of time when I got to this last section. That just kind of some general lessons from the parable of the talents. Members of the body of Christ do have differing talents. My talents may not be the same as yours. Someone may have even more talent than someone else. Doesn't make you better than anybody else if you have more talent. It actually increases your responsibility to put those talents to use to the Master's glory. But it is a fact that people have different talents. And that's, again, that's in the wisdom of God, because if everybody had the same talent, we wouldn't get anything done. Because everybody just able to do the one thing. Another lesson here is that some people are going to lose their soul due to laziness. We pointed out numerous times. In fact, it's every single instance of judgment in this chapter. Judgment is meted out, condemnation is meted out, not because of some grave, immoral sin. It's not to say that we shouldn't be avoiding immorality. Obviously we should. But every instance of condemnation in these three stories or parables in chapter 25, it's on the basis of something right that was not done, not on the basis of wrong that was done. So some people are going to lose their souls simply due to laziness. Another lesson, it doesn't matter if our abilities are few or many. Touched on this just a moment ago. What is most important is that we use what we have faithfully. It may not be that somebody is super talented as a public speaker or something like that. But what do you have? What is your talent, and how are you using it for the Lord? Because we all have some kind of ability. And you have something unique to you that you can put to use in the kingdom. Another lesson here, our purpose or task in life is to serve God and bring Him glory. We need to make sure that's what we're seeking to do every single day. Another lesson, this is number 5 on my list. Each servant must give an account to Jesus. We are servants of the Master, and one day as we point out several times already, just in this early part of this chapter, we're stewards. It's required in stewards that a man be found faithful, 1 Corinthians 4, verse 2. And so one day, as stewards, we're going to have to give an account of our stewardship. Number 6, if we don't use our talents, we will lose them. We saw that with the one-talent man. He didn't use his talent. He buried it. He hid it. He lost that talent. By the way, we also pointed out, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. We also pointed out last week that we can actually increase our talent, right? The 2-talent man ended up with 4. The 5-talent man ended up with 11, right? 10 originally, because he doubled what he had, but the 1 talent that was taken away from the unfaithful 1-talent man was given to the man who had doubled his 5 talents. So he technically ended up with 11. But again, it's the idea of increasing. We can increase our ability. In fact, I love to watch. It's sometimes one of those things, you don't always notice it over time. It's kind of like your children, you live with your children every day and you don't notice it until maybe you go back and look at an old picture or a home movie or something and you go, whoa, when did he grow up so much? When did she grow up so much? It's a lot of times the same way with some of the young men that I've known and watched as they preach. And they preach more and more. And sometimes even I remember one of the elders in my home congregation when I was just a boy, we had a youth guy. And he was our youth guy for a little while. And he went and ended up preaching somewhere down the southern part of the county and just became a tremendous preacher. And just his ability to speak and communicate was just amazing. But this one particular elder in my home congregation, he would often say, and he would tell this brother that, he'd say, I used to say, that boy's never going to make a preacher. He'd say, first few times I heard you preach, I thought, this poor fella, he's in for a tough time because he's just not going to make it. But he used that ability, what ability he had, and at least in one man's opinion, he was a 1-talent person as far as that goes. But sometimes, there are talents and abilities that we use and they increase, right? Every preacher I've ever seen that maybe they were in a situation where they're preaching once a month or as needed in a congregation or something like that. And sometimes they get in a situation where maybe they go and become a local preacher where they're preaching every Sunday, and you could just watch the growth because they're developing it. And it's like I told the preacher students in Costa Rica, you may get up one Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and preach what you're just convinced is quite possibly the worst sermon you have ever done in your entire life as a preacher. But 6 more days, and you're going to have another shot. And so you're going to have a chance to, you could make it right and do a better job, and we've all been there as preachers. But that constant, and you're developing. So talent can be increased, and we could add that, I guess, as number 6b or 7, even if we wanted to add it as another lesson from this parable. Number 7 or 8, depending on how you want to count that previous one. Some will be lesson here. Some will be lost, not because of what they did that was wrong. We pointed this out already as well, but because of what they failed to do that was right. Another lesson here, we got to be careful not to compare ourselves with others. We're not in competition with each other. And when we start comparing, it brings only bad fruit, jealousy, pride, division. Now, it's not to say that we can never do that in a way that it could actually be beneficial, but I would encourage us all, we got to be very careful about that because it's not a competition. It's not to say, we're going to have a door knocking, and so it's great for people to turn out for the door knocking. But if you start having people saying, well, I knocked 200 doors, how many did you get? And it starts becoming a competition, well, then we're doing something for the wrong reason. And somebody might even say, well, hey, I knocked 200 doors. You knocked 300, but let me tell you something. I set up this number of studies. How many did you set up? And, again, you could see where that could very easily devolve into something that God would not have it to be. I don't remember if I mentioned this last week. I don't know if wouldn't necessarily call this a lesson from the parable of the talents, but it is worth mentioning. It would definitely be an abuse, to say the least, of this parable, to say that what it means and teaches is that the church of the Lord ought to take up a lot of contribution money, put it into a savings account so that it draws interest for the Lord. That is obviously not what this parable is teaching. In fact, as we've often pointed out, God's church is not in the banking business. If you need banking, you want to be involved in that, go to a bank. That's not the church's work. And I'll just debate if I should even say it, but I'm just going to say it. I've told people before, and it is what it is. It's one of the larger reasons why I came to the Bremen congregation 10 years ago, because I was very frustrated with a small congregation with over $250,000 sitting in a bank account just drawing interest. A building that's paid for, property that's paid for, no long-term debt, just power bills, water bill, trash, that kind of thing. But over $250,000 just sitting in the bank. And when it came up about a television program, an evangelistic outreach in our county, don't think we could do anything with that because we're just a small congregation. When a young man came, in fact, most of the Bremen folks know Aaron Dodson. I've known Aaron since he was a boy, known him from the backwoods camp in Lineville, Alabama. Aaron decided he was going to go and train to preach. Going to go to the Memphis School of Preaching. He started raising support, and so I was all about that because I've known Aaron for years, and in fact, I was excited because I thought this young man is going to do great things for the Lord. So I presented that to the elders. Well, what about it? Let's support this young man, be a part of training him to preach the gospel. Well, I don't know that we could get into a long-term commitment. Long-term is 2 years. Well, I know, but I said, look, people used to support me when I was in preaching school, and I said on average, probably maybe even a little above average was about $100 a month from a congregation. I had several congregations that did $100 a month, one or two here and there that did like $300 or $400. But I said, if we did $100 a month for 2 years, you don't want to be locked into some kind of commitment. All right, $2,400. 2 years worth for $100 a month. And we've helped train a young man to preach the gospel, and I can tell you, I know this young man, he's going to do good things. We're just a small congregation. Give me a break. The church is not in the banking business, folks. That's not what it's to be about, and that certainly is not what this parable is teaching. And if somebody thinks that, then bless their heart, they may not even be accountable, or they got an agenda and they're trying to justify something, because it's pretty obvious on the face of it. That's not what the parable is teaching. That's a gross abuse of verse 27. But it is something that I wanted to mention because sometimes people can get mistaken about that. All right, let's go into this last section of the chapter, 31 through 46. I told you before, these, obviously the previous two is the parable of the 10 virgins, parable of the talents. I don't know if you want to call this a parable or not. I think we call a parable what? How do we define a parable typically? Earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's not exactly an earthly story, so... but you probably have already noticed I refer to it as a parable quite often. It's kind of, I don't know what else you would call it. Story, parable, they're so similar. But understand it's not an earthly story because it's depicting the judgment. But it is teaching a heavenly meaning, obviously. But be that as it may, it's the heading in my Bible just says description, the description of the last judgment. So he says, when the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations. Well, that's everybody, right? And he shall separate them one from another as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. If you've ever been to the Biblical History Center, you've seen that, how the shepherd in his sheepfold, he divides the sheep on the right hand from the goats on the left. You have a higher wall there on the left because the goats tend to jump, and they're also mischievous, and they will try to teach the sheep to jump and to climb and to try to get out. And so a shepherd automatically, coming into the fold, separates his sheep from his goats. He wants them separate. And so those goats, because they're kind of known to be naughty and into mischief, they go over here. So that Jesus is using a very familiar illustration for his audience. It may not be as familiar to us, but to them, they immediately picture this scene with the shepherd, and they understand that division, that separation that takes place. He shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Notice then, he says, then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was an hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. And it's interesting because the righteous answer in verse 37, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And you know the verses, no doubt. The king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. Well, Jesus is, keep in mind, I've said it, in every single one of these stories, parables, however you want to phrase it, this is the same occasion, same time we might say, same place, same audience as chapter 24, the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents. This is all part of that Olivet discourse, as we sometimes call it. And who is he speaking to? His apostles. This is not like a massive audience like the Sermon on the Mount or something like that. Obviously the teaching is for all, but in that immediate context, he's speaking to his apostles. So keep that in mind, and he's telling them, and you know it's worth mentioning here, and we'll notice it again later on. Are these hardened worldly sinners that he's trying to bring to repentance? No. Are these religious-minded people? They are, right? I mean, these are the people that have been following Jesus for right at 3.5 years at this point. So he's addressing religious people. That's worth mentioning as well. So the purpose here with giving this depiction of or description of the judgment is to show disciples of Jesus that while we are waiting for him to return to judge all mankind, as he will do at his second coming, then we have a responsibility. And a large part of our responsibility is to be helping others. To be helping others, right? So that's kind of your main idea here. And again, that's where it's so similar to a parable, because parables always have that one main lesson. And that's the main lesson here. Now, is he saying that's the sole responsibility of his disciples as they await his return and the judgment? No. Is it a responsibility of Christians to assemble with the church? Absolutely. Is it a responsibility of Christians to study their Bibles? Absolutely. To pray? Sure. On and on we could go. He's not discounting any of that. But this depiction of the judgment is showing one of the great responsibilities we have as we go through our lives awaiting his return and the final judgment is helping others. So keep that in mind. Today, just like many years gone by. People sometimes mock the Lord. They sometimes mock his cross, his gospel, his church. They sometimes mock the doctrine of his second coming. Peter talked about scoffers in the last days, 2 Peter chapter 3. But when the Son of Man comes again to judge all men, there are some things that are going to be made clear on that day. In fact, on that day, for the first time, some people are going to discover some things. And that's kind of the way I'm following Papaw's outline here in his notes. Reagan's dad is the way he's got it set up is in exposition of this last section of Matthew 25 is when Jesus comes again, ... So we could say, number one, when Jesus comes again, all men will know that Jesus really is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And we could say, number two, in fact, I'll go ahead and give you these points. Number two, we could say that when Jesus comes again, all humans will know that there really will be a permanent separation of humans, souls. Number three, when Jesus comes again, some disciples of Jesus will learn that they will be lost because they neglected their duty. And then four, when Jesus comes again, many will discover that they are simply unprepared. Some are going to discover that they're just unprepared, right? And so we must be ready when Jesus comes again. Be fulfilling this responsibility to be helping others. So when Jesus comes again, everybody's going to know that Jesus really is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We see that in 31 and 32. He's going to come in his glory, holy angels with him. He's going to sit upon the throne of his glory. Well, there's nobody that will be able to argue then that he is King of Kings. And furthermore, before him shall be gathered all nations. And he's going to begin to separate them, again, showing his authority as the king. If he is sitting on the throne of his glory, then he is king, right? He's not going to become king then. He is king now, sitting on his throne. He's received that authority, as Daniel saw in the vision, Daniel 7, 13, and 14. And at the end, as Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, 24 through 26, he's going to deliver up the kingdom to the Father. He has the authority to judge and to separate all nations. Pointed that out right there in the beginning of verse 32. His authority is not just over the Jews, folks. It's not just over Americans or this country or that country. His authority is over all. That includes Jews, Christians, whether New Testament Christians or those just claiming to be Christians. His authority is over Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists. Listen, they're all going to be there at the judgment. And I know that's not popular to say in the world today, but I'm telling you, it's biblical. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And some people, maybe even without even thinking about it too much, some people outright think about it and they just kind of take this position. But I think sometimes if we're not careful, we can take this position by default because we just don't really give it a lot of thought. And it's like, let's take the gospel to people in our country, say, and the maybe it's somebody that runs a 7-Eleven type store, and maybe they're Hindu, or maybe there's somebody that at a restaurant, maybe they're Buddhist. I just leave them alone. They got their system. Well, that system's not exalting Jesus as Lord, and therefore it is inherently flawed. And sometimes people say, well, Chad, don't you think that's a bit audacious, a bit maybe arrogant to say? Listen, if there were any chance that it's not true, perhaps, but at the same time, let's be honest, we understand, and it just, I've preached lessons on this before, and I'll try not to belabor it, but it does get me kind of fired up. Truth, by its very nature, it's narrow. Nobody says, if you dial a wrong number, nobody's calling up the phone company and saying the very idea, I missed one digit, and you won't put me in touch with my wife or my child or whoever you're trying to reach, and I've had it. You narrow-minded, arrogant people, I'm sick of it. Nobody does that. We understand. Oh, my bad. Hit the wrong number. Obviously my fault. Nobody has a problem admitting that. When you have a combination lock and you get a digit wrong, everybody understands that. If you get one little number wrong, it's not going to open because it's narrow. And hey, we want it that way, don't we? When we're trying to lock something and keep dishonest people out. Everybody understands that. But sometimes you come over into the spiritual realm, people say, oh, now don't say that there's just one way. Other people have their beliefs. And listen, I don't ever want to be unkind to anybody, ever, nor should any of us. We should never want to be ugly, belligerent, caustic, abrasive. But the truth is the truth. My grandmother used to say all the time, the truth will stand when the world's on fire. And folks, that's absolutely right. And so in that day, Jesus, it'll be known, Jesus really is King of Kings over all nations. They're all going to stand before him in judgment. He is a king, he is the king, and he has the authority to judge. Some people don't know that Jesus is king. Some people don't care that Jesus is king. But on that day, they'll know and they'll understand just how important it is. There are so many Old Testament prophecies of Jesus, the Messiah, being king. There are New Testament passages, numerous New Testament passages we could bring out that show Jesus is a king. He says, my kingdom's not of this world, John 18:36, but he is a king. And in fact, Christians are translated into the kingdom of his dear son, God's dear son, Jesus, Colossians 1:13 and 14. He's the blessed and only potentate, 1 Timothy 6:15 and 16. On and on we could go. So we've got to obey him now while we still have time and opportunity. And that's so important because on the day of judgment, it'll be too late. We should confess. We should bow, Philippians 2:10 and 11. We should bow because one day we will bow. And that's Romans 14. I'm going to have to double check myself. I want to say 11. Yes. 14:11. As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So we should bow because one day we will. And as Robert pointed out, if we wait until that day, we will, and we will be filled with regret, despair, because then it's too late. And it's kind of like you can see people going, okay, I believe now. But at that point, it's too late because the judgment is set. So we should confess him because we will confess one day. Second, as we pointed out, when Jesus comes again, all will know that there really will be a permanent separation of mankind. The Bible teaches us plainly in numerous passages, but again, some people don't know this. Some people just don't care. Verse 32 shows there is going to be a separation. Verse 33 shows we'll be divided into two different groups, described with the illustration of sheep and goats. Verse 46, when you get down to the end of the chapter, these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. So verse 46 shows the duration of the separation. It's going to be permanent, eternal. Why will there be a separation? Well, some are blessed, verse 34. Some are cursed, verse 41. Some are righteous, some are not, verse 46. There are only two places prepared. In fact, we touched on this Sunday morning in the sermon last week, or this week, I guess. There are only two places prepared, only two possible destinies. One is described as the kingdom in verse 34, or in verse 46 as eternal life. And the other option is eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels, verse 41, or everlasting punishment is the term used in verse 46. Only two options. All of humanity will be eternally in one of those two places. Right now, good and evil exist together on this earth. But when Jesus comes to judge, of course, there will be a separation of the evil and the righteous. And that separation, again, will be from that point forward eternally. No ending to that. And so when Jesus comes again, everybody will know that there is going to be a permanent separation for mankind. One of the things that I've pointed out before is, in preaching on heaven, is that's one of the things that makes heaven so desirable. Have you ever been, I love, in some ways at least, to go to live sporting events or something like that, but have you ever been in one of those situations where you're sitting in front of or behind or near that guy who's had not just a few too many, but way too many? Or maybe he's just a jerk. And I certainly hope none of us have ever been that guy, but a lot of us have been there, right? And it's miserable. And sometimes you have somebody who is so obnoxious. And I mean, the language, and I can't remember, it's been so long ago, I can't remember if I was there with somebody or if I feel like they were telling me about it, that somebody was actually saying to this person at some sporting event, like, buddy, do you mind, I got my kids here with me. I'm talking little kids. And the guy's like, I don't care about your kids, blah, blah, blah. And the fellow's trying to be, he was being very Christ-like, meek, and the guy was just so inconsiderate. And all that just to say, one of the things that makes heaven desirable to us is you don't have to deal with any of that. And nobody will be unkind to each other. Nobody will be obnoxious to each other in heaven, because there's going to be a separation. Those kind of folks are not going to be in the heavenly realm. If we're the type of person that's going to be obnoxious and hateful and mean, that's not the kind of person that's going to be going to heaven. So there's going to be that separation. Number 3, when Jesus comes again, some disciples of Jesus are going to learn that they're going to be lost because they neglected their duty. This gets us down to verse where we left off, verse 41. Then, this is the main point of 41 through the end of the chapter. There are going to be some disciples of Jesus who are going to be lost because they neglected their duty. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was an hungry, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick, and in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Again, here's your main message in these verses. Some of God's people, disciples of Jesus, followers of Jesus, religious people, are going to be lost because they neglected their duty. The whole overarching main lesson of this judgment scene is the necessity of doing good. We know Galatians 6:10, right? As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto those who are of the household of faith. And again, that's not the only condition for salvation, but let us not kid ourselves and think that it's not necessary either. Those described as cursed, again, no unbelief that they're condemned for, no immorality, no false teaching. They just didn't help others. They didn't do what they could. And it's sad, because are there Christians that are going to lose their souls because they didn't help people who were in need? Based on what we read right here, yes. There might even be folks who attend every service of the church. I mean, they don't miss, but they won't lift a finger to help somebody who's in need. And I'm not talking has to be financial. In fact, sometimes the best way to help is giving time as opposed to giving money. Sometimes it's easier just to give money than to give time and to give ourselves. But either way, we're not saying it's got to be one thing or the other. But sometimes you got folks that will, very adamant about it. I'm going to be at the services of the church, but they don't help people that are in need. Whether those people are brethren in Christ or whether they're just somebody who's not a Christian. Again, a lot of times there's an opportunity for evangelism there, and that's what we always ought to be thinking about. There are people who maybe they study their Bible, maybe even beyond the four walls of the church building. They understand that's important. They understand prayer is important. But my point is we need to understand helping others is important as well. So again, we see this general principle, being guilty for failing to do what we're supposed to do. As pointed out last week, sometimes people think, well, I don't do this, I don't do that. And they could give you a big, long list of all the things that they don't do. But it's like adding up a column of zeros, and you end up with 0. It's not a matter of just, well, I don't do this, don't do that. Hey, that's wonderful, and I'm not knocking that. But we got to be active in our service for the Master, and that's what he's teaching here. In verses 42 and 43, you see areas here in which the servants of Jesus have opportunity to help others. A lot of times we forget about others. We forget about our duty to others when we have a full belly, right? And when we have clothes on our back, shelter over our head. Is it not easy in those situations to forget about others? And you know as well as I do, in our world we got to be, you sometimes want to make sure you're doing your due diligence. Because there are charlatans, there are people that will scam you. But I have also said, and I still maintain this, I try to be wise when it comes to giving help, especially any kind of financial type of help. But I think I'd rather find out. I heard a story one time of a golfer years ago, some famous top of the world golfer at that time. I want to say it was like the early 1900s, but he'd won a tournament and gotten one of those big checks, and some lady came out in the parking lot and she was talking about she was homeless and she was hungry and her baby was, they were in danger of being, maybe they were not homeless, but they were about to be kicked out of their house or something like that. She just had this whole story, and he turned around and wrote her a check or maybe gave her cash or something, but it was a decent amount of money. I think it was a day later or so, somebody came up and said, I heard about that lady coming up to you in the parking lot. And he says, yeah. He said, I heard you gave her some money. Yeah, I did. And he said, well, I got news for you, buddy. She scammed you. She lied. And he says, you mean that lady's not going hungry? He said, no. She's got food, I assure you. And he said, you mean there's not a child that's sick and in danger of dying without this needed money for medical help? He said, nope. That baby's healthy as can be. And that fellow said, well, that's the best news I've had all week. I feel better about that situation. Two ways to look at it, right? Sometimes we just get so furious. Oh, they lied to me, they scammed me, whatever. Or we could say, hey, at least that child is healthy. Again, I think it's obvious we want to be careful, cautious. But if I end up at the day of judgment and I find out, God says, oh, by the way, this person you helped out, they were actually not being totally honest. But bless you, because you didn't know that and you were just trying to do the right thing. I'd much rather have that scenario happen than to have God say to me on that day, this person over here, these people, you assumed that they were scamming you like that previous person had done, and you sent them away, and Chad, they were really in need. They were sincere. They just needed some help. And you sent them away. And that's kind of what you see here in this judgment scene. So I'd far rather have the former situation on the day of judgment than the latter. So sometimes we forget when we get a full belly, the roof over our head, clothes on our back. It's easy to forget. Some people are just willing to sit back and watch others do the dirty work. Let them handle it. Don't ask me. Some people don't help the needy because they're ignorant of that responsibility. Some people don't because they just don't necessarily have the opportunity. Some people run across folks in need more than others, I guess we could say. Some people don't because they're busy with their own affairs. God save us from Christians that are so wrapped up in their own tiny little world that they ain't got time, if you'll pardon my Alabama grammar, they just ain't got time to see anybody else who's in need. They don't see anybody in need because guess what? They don't look beyond their own little circle. Their family, their friends, their little world, and they don't ever look outside of it. And so they are ignorant in that sense, but they're not ignorant because they just don't know. They're ignorant because they really when you get down to it, they don't care because they're so consumed with their own lives and their own affairs. Some people would like to help, but they just don't arrange their finances for such. Again, that's an area where we could make it a goal that I'm going to try to arrange financially to help, or maybe I don't. You may, most of us here probably could, but you may be where you can't financially, but again, there are other ways to help besides finances. It could be time, effort, and so on. But we all need to be helping others. If Jesus showed up, if Jesus were here among us and he said, I have a need, a physical need, there'd be so many people in here falling all over themselves to try to help the master. But what we learn from this judgment scene is that those people genuinely in need, when we help them, that's what we're doing. We're helping Jesus. And when we fail to help them, in reality, we are turning down the master himself and saying, sorry, can't help you, when what we really mean is won't. And then when Jesus comes again, many are going to discover they're unprepared. Many will be surprised on that day to find out God really does exist. There really is a God. There really is life after death. Many will be surprised on that day to find out not everybody's going to be saved. And you know, a lot of people are going to be surprised on that day to find out not every religious person will be saved. Reminds us of Matthew 7:21-23, right? Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. And he goes on to talk about those that will say, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? In thy name cast out demons, thy name done many wonderful works. But he says, I'll profess it to them, I never knew you, depart from me. Why? Well, because they didn't do the will of the Father. So not all religious people will be saved. Some will be surprised on that day to find out there really is eternal punishment in hellfire, Gehenna. Some people deny that, but on that day, the sad reality is some people are going to find out the hard way. May we not find ourselves among that number. We need not find ourselves among that number. All we got to do is follow the Lord and trust in him and trust what he tells us through his word. And we won't be among that number, but those are some, in fact, I think about Brother Brinkley's sermon, the last night of our gospel meeting. This was all the way back in 2013. But I remember the title of that sermon because it stuck with me. Judgment Day Surprises. Going to be some surprises on the day of judgment. These verses teach us to watch and be ready for the Lord's coming. What are we to do before the Lord comes again? The parable of the 10 virgins tell us, prepare. The parable of the talents tell us to use what God has given us to his glory and work for him. And this story of the judgment scene tells us we need to be serving others. By the way, did you notice both these groups? They don't understand. When did we do this, Lord? When did we help you? When did we visit you, feed you? You know why they asked that question? They weren't doing it because, oh, guys, we better do this because we'll be getting credit from the master. It was just second nature to them. They turn around at the judgment. They go, when did we do those things? And he says, oh, remember when you helped this person, that person? That's when. It was just second nature to them. The flip side is true for the other group. Wait, time out, Lord. When did we not do that for you? When did we not feed you, not visit you? You see, they didn't think anything about it. Oh, you remember all those people you turned down that were genuinely in need and they needed help? You denied me that help. May it never be so among God's people. Thank you very much. That'll get us through chapter 25. We'll pick up in chapter 26 next week as Jesus begins the road to Calvary. Thank you very much. We will be dismissed from our class, and Brother Chris will have some announcements shortly.